Alright guys, my name's Austin here. I run the Dream In Rotary YouTube channel. I have the Dream In Rotary username on RX7 Club. I also own the web domain, Instagram, and Facebook page for Dream In Rotary. It's just something I came up with randomly one day. Just something that popped into my head. I wanted to do something Rotary themed for a username again. Came up with it and made the domain and all that stuff. I am the one who made the T2 swap comparison video with my old gray car on YouTube here. It's got about 10,000 views on it now. I sold that car a while back to my buddy Bruce. He's actually got it up for sale right now again here in 2015. Because of that swap, I've kind of learned that it would help a lot of people if I were to do a YouTube swap kind of series. So what I'm going to be doing here on this red car is a T2 swap. Had the suggestion, decided I'd finally do it. Nobody else has done it yet that I know of. So this video is going to be based on the frequently asked questions and tips that people generally ask about the T2 swap on the forums and that they've asked me personally. So first I'm going to start out with the frequently asked questions. The first one I always get is the cost. How much does it cost to swap? The joke I've always had is that it costs 4 times more than you think it's going to cost, and it's going to take you 8 times longer to do it. So first, the costs. Generally, you can get a swap for $1,500 easy for some REW or a T2. But generally, from what I've done, the cost is going to be about $5 grand minimum to get it in there and running. You guys can argue back and forth with me, but the reason it costs so much is all those little add-ons that you're going to have to do to the chassis to get it ready to run. Bigger fuel line, unless you have a GSL SE. All sorts of just little things like that keep adding up over time, especially the trips to the hardware store. So it's probably going to be about $5 grand minimum to put one in there. Time, I said it's going to take about 8 times longer than you think it's going to take. It took me about 3 months minimum each time. This time it's going to take me a little bit longer because I'm doing more to the chassis. So plan for about 3 months, and a big chunk of that's going to be the wiring. The engine stuff is really not that hard. It's just putting different parts on. I'll go over that in a minute. The third thing I always get asked is what you need to do to run it. You need the Racing Beat 12A to 13B adapter, unless you're running a GSL SE. The reason you need that is because it's stock in the engine. The 12A is shorter than the 13B, so Racing Beat sells that adapter to go from 12A to 13B on the stock First Gen engine mounts. Easiest way you're going to do it, I tried notching one of the things one time, and if you re-weld the back on it you can run it, but I didn't really trust mine because I didn't weld it very well. So I'd recommend the Racing Beat one. You need the GSL SE front cover and oil pan. You can't run without it unless you're going to run an FC subframe with an FC engine. I talked to somebody about doing an REW on an FC subframe, and they said it was kind of a nightmare in the first gen chassis, so it's not necessarily recommended. You can do it, but I wouldn't. So you need the GSL SE front cover and oil pan. You need the stock engine ECU or an aftermarket for the engine that you decide to run. The stock ECU definitely leaves a lot to be desired. You definitely want to run an aftermarket one if you can. You're going to need the wiring harnesses from the engine from the car that the engine came out of that you're doing the swap from. So a T2, you're going to need the T2 right side and left side chassis wiring harnesses to depin them and pick out the ones you need. You can run aftermarket harnesses too. I've seen some guys do it. One guy here in Minnesota did it with a T-bucket wiring harness for pretty cheap. He rewired his engine that way. It'd be nice and be really cheap probably that way, so keep in mind you can do an aftermarket wiring harness as well. And then the aftermarket drive shaft. You do need one. You can't run a stock FB drive shaft, and you can't run the FC drive shaft. So that's the end of the third section, but the fourth one was the drive shaft. I actually had Proven Force here in Minnesota build me a custom drive shaft from the FC T2 yoke on the tranny to the rear flange in the first gen. That cost me $550 or something like that to get that drive shaft done. It was very well done, completely 100% the way it should have been. Highly recommended to go to those guys. But I actually ordered my last one from Mazda Tricks. They have the T2 yoke and they have the FB drive shafts. They know what they're doing. So all I did was call them up and tell them I'm building a Turbo 2 swap. I need the Turbo 2 yoke on the front of a first gen drive shaft. And they're like, okay, and ended up shipping it out to me for about $354 shipped for the part. So I spent about $200 less going through Mazda Tricks this time. So I'd keep in mind that one, you're going to have to get that, so you'd have to plan for that extra $350. Number 5 on the frequently asked questions is how hard is the wiring? The wiring is hard unless you're willing to learn. If you're willing to learn how to do the wiring, really not that hard. If you are intimidated by it, you are scared of it, you let it dominate you and scare you out of it, it'll be really hard and you'll get really frustrated and really confused. The first time I did it, it took me probably 6 weeks or so to do the wiring myself. I sat in the house and wanted to make sure I was completely done with everything, and that was 6 weeks in the house getting everything ready and then putting it in the car. Took a little bit, probably a couple weeks. So if you're willing to learn the wiring, it's not too hard. I actually joked with somebody the other day that it's color coded like a kid's book. You just follow the wiring thing, it'll tell you where to go. How fast is the car is the 6th thing I always get asked. Is how fast it is. It is fast. It'll definitely get you in trouble. It's not gonna be as quick as a lot of V8s in some ways. The V8 swap you're gonna get more torque and more horsepower from, for probably cheaper than the rotary in a lot of ways. But I prefer the rotary just because I like the uniqueness of it. Eventually I will build a V8 one, hopefully. Be called like the RX Vet or something like that. My buddy's got one, Tanner, it's awesome. And then the last frequently asked question I get asked, is it worth it? That's a very loaded question, in my opinion, if it's worth it or not to swap a first gen. The first gen chassis I love because they're dirt cheap, parts are dirt cheap for them. Awesome chassis to begin with. The aftermarket support is not really there for a first gen in my opinion yet. I've discussed this with multiple first gen guys. You second gen and third gen guys have the world at your fingertips as far as aftermarket, and the first gen really doesn't at this point. So it is worth it in my opinion. You got to put probably about $5 grand into the chassis on top of whatever you paid getting it. So keep that in mind. You're going to be about $6 to $7 grand into it probably when you're done. You can get an FD roller for that. You can get an FD, some running one. Probably wouldn't want to drive it very much without a rebuild, but you could probably get an FD for under $7 grand right now. So keep that in mind. The cost is expensive. The time is expensive. It'll cost you a lot of time. If you have a significant other, they'll get pretty ticked off about it. Mine is very understanding and told me I could build it this time. She wants me to build it, but it takes a lot of time. You do need that laundry list of stuff. There's only about 5 or 6 things there, but you have to have those unless you're doing something else I don't know about. The drive shaft is a custom drive shaft. You can't run a first gen drive shaft or a second gen. You have to run a combination of the both. And the wiring is hard, but if you're willing to learn, it's not too bad. It will be fast and it will be fun. I've beaten R32 Golf with it, Mark 5 actually. R32 Golf with the DSG tranny. It is very fast, and it is worth it. If you love the first gen chassis like I do, I can't get away from them because they're so dirt cheap and easy to find. So now I'll go on to the tips. I picked out 7 tips to building one. First one might seem obvious, but it's kind of a tongue-in-cheek, pun intended. The first one is to own a first gen. Don't try to build one in your mind without owning a car first. My recommendation is to get one. Don't theorize if you don't have one yet. It's a fun swap, but don't try to sit and plan one out here watching the videos without actually owning one and driving one to decide whether you like the solid rear axle, the crappy front steering, unless you've replaced components. And then have one a while before deciding to do it. When I decided to do mine, I'd had it for about a year and a half. Driven it 12A stock the whole time. Was an awesome daily driven car. I drove it all summer, put it away in the winter here in Minnesota because the salt would rust it out. I decided to do it because I couldn't really stand the poor 12A. It was just really slow for me. So I wanted to upgrade it. The second tip I've got is to own a basic tool set. My last one I built with all hand tools. I didn't have any pneumatic tools. I had a Sawzall, and that's pretty much the only electrical tool I used. The hand tools will do the entire swap if you're patient enough. The only thing that really sucks to use the hand tools for is that big flywheel nut and the front nut if it's really stuck on the front cover pulley. And be open to buying new tools. You're going to need to buy tools you didn't have before. I had to buy a chain grip vise from AutoZone, like one of their AC Delco ones, because I couldn't hold the front pulley bolt the way I needed to pull it off. So be open to buying new tools. Even cheap ones. I've got a bunch of cheap tools and they're working so well so far. Third tip is to possess some mechanical knowledge, but preferably a lot. Work on a car before deciding to do the swap, and work on your specific car before deciding to do the swap, so you know kind of the ins and outs of it and how hard and how easy it is to do certain things on the car. The joke we always run is you want to have small hands, because the guys who engineered these cars must have had really small hands to fit in some of the places that they put stuff, because it's pretty ridiculous sometimes. And be willing to learn and not give up on the car. It will be very, very challenging for most of the build, even no matter how many swaps you've done. If you've never done one in a Japanese car before, it is different. It's easy if you possess the mechanical knowledge to do it. It's not very easy if you don't exactly like to learn how to work on cars. The fourth tip I have, I actually have trouble swallowing, is the large amount of patience. It does take a long time to get it done, a lot of money to get it done, and you have to be patient enough to purchase the right things at the right time and to hunt for the right parts for a long time. I got really lucky in this build and had somebody sell me everything I needed for the swap, including the adapter for the SE front cover, oil pan, and the Racing Beat 12A to 13B adapter, and that was extremely lucky. I thought I'd have to shop for those parts for months. The other thing with that large amount of patience is you either have to have a lot of patience or a lot of ADD or ADHD, which I swear I have most days. You got to be able to walk away from certain projects if you get frustrated with them and pick a different one that's a little less stressful. I end up doing that quite a bit. Just kind of helps me relax. At some point you'll be driven batty, you'll go nuts. There's certain stuff that really gets to you. Most people it's the wiring. For me the wiring's kind of methodical, but there's certain other things in this chassis that I'm learning, like the auto to manual swap is driving me batty right now, so I've kind of ignored it for a couple days. Fifth tip is to be creative and innovative. Every chassis swap is different. When I say chassis swap, I mean this is an auto 12A originally, GS. The last one I did was a manual GS 12A. Every single one will be different no matter what T2 V8 swap you look at. Everybody's done it differently. There isn't two of the same. If there was, I'd be kind of scared. There's no way that every wire was run the same way to the same place. You're going to have to be creative and you're going to have to be innovative in the swap to figure it out correctly. Number 6, my tip is don't give up on it. It'll be really hard at certain points. If you give up on it, you'll have a couple $1,000s worth of parts sitting around and nowhere to go with them, because we all know reselling is no fun, especially on the forums. eBay's not as bad, but you're going to have to be persistent at it and not give up on the swap. It'll take a while, but it'll be fun once it's done. And then the 7th tip that I have for it is to have fun along the way. I actually generally build my cars myself the whole time. I've never had anybody else really help me with it. My dad helped me push the engine in my last one, but other than that I pretty much did everything myself. So try to have some fun along the way. I actually brought my fiance in here yesterday, had her look at the sunroof and the louvers that I bought for this car to see what she liked about it and try to get her opinion on it. You got to decide what you're going to build it for. You want it to be a fun cruiser car, Turbo 2 swap, or REW, or Renesis, or whatever, 20B, whatever you want to run. Have fun along the way with it, and if you're going to have significant other involved in it, have them give you some input on it. They're obviously probably the second most important thing as far as the swap goes. Your opinion is first, and hers is probably second. Unless you got your priorities straight, then hers is probably first. You want to make sure to keep your entire family happy at the same time. Don't go into the poorhouse while doing it. And just make sure it's a fun car when you're done with it. The last one I did, I ran open down pipe off the turbo from Racing V to 2.5 inch. It ended right before the passenger seat, cooked anybody in the passenger seat, had no AC, hot as all get out here in Minnesota when it gets muggy in the summer. If that would have been a down south car, you'd have died. So make sure you're going to make it a fun car. This one's going to get keep the whole AC system in it, potentially get the windows tinted, sound deadening in it, stuff like that. I'm trying to make it very creature comfort. Try to make it actually a fun car to be in versus something that the significant other doesn't want to be in and that nobody else really wants to ride in. So just have fun with it. Enjoy what you're doing and make it worth it in the end. That's one of the questions I always get asked is it worth it? Yes, it's worth it. So the next video that I'm going to shoot is going to be picking a chassis for it, so feel free to tune in on that. Then after that I'm going to do picking an engine for it, and then the next one I'm going to do is the wiring. I've already shot some video for that, for de-pinning, and then the tucking and install of the wiring that I'm going to do. So that's it for this video. Sorry for the rambling, just kind of stuff that I wanted to talk about before you guys go off and buy a Turbo 2 somewhere. This is Austin Lindahl for Dream and Rotary here checking out. We'll see you guys on the next video.